The presidency has been a long treasured position among politicians alike. Presidents have held office since before the Constitution. Many qualifications are required of the job and benefits are reaped if one is elected to the office. With this introduction, let's get started. Qualifications. Ever since the Constitution was enacted, the presidency was elected by popular vote through an electoral college rather than parliament, which occurred before the Constitution. Requirements to become a president include: first, the president must be a natural-born citizen of the U.S. Under certain conditions can the president be born outside the U.S. For example, if an American couple bear a child in China and he or she chooses to become a legal U.S. citizen at the age of 18, then they are eligible to run for the office of president despite the fact that they were born in China. This qualification is important because it prevents any feeling of nationality from influencing a candidate. Therefore, if a 100% Chinese person took over the presidency, it might provoke the Chinese to use the president by using him for their own benefit rather than him or her leading the U.S. as they are supposed to. Second point brought up is to be eligible for president, you have to be at least 35 years old. Not 34, not 36, but 35, as you can see my Monty Python Holy Grenade reference. This requirement is important because what if we had younger candidates running for president, like people 13 to 20? That could, like, 13 could be the lowest age that you could run for president. Obviously, with less age comes less experience, and if we had a young person take office with inadequate experience, it could lead the country on a path of destruction, which would take a lot to recuperate. Some fun facts about that is the youngest president ever was Theodore Roosevelt, who took the office of president at the age of 42 after McKinley's assassination. Now, most people would say that JFK was the youngest president, which is true if you're the youngest president to be elected to office, which Kennedy was at the age of 43. The oldest president that ever took the office was Ronald Reagan, who was 69 when he took the oath to become a president, which is pretty cool because that's past like today's standard retirement age, which is like age 60 to 62, kind of that deal. The third and final constitutional requirement is to be able to run for president, he or she must be a resident of the U.S. for at least 4 years prior to taking office. What's important about this is living in the U.S. for 14 consecutive years provides enough time for someone like you and me to learn about the structures of government and how the government adapts to situations such as rising gas prices or natural disasters. So, these situations can benefit how someone would interpret the situation as they are fulfilling their dreams to become president. This means that for someone to be able to become president, they have to live in the U.S. for at least 14 years to be eligible. Extra stuff a candidate should have. There are qualifications that are not necessarily required by law to become president, but they enhance the chances of someone taking office, as do all jobs have. These include, but are not limited to, government experience. If someone has a background of being a state senator or governor, it betters their chances in most cases because it provides a smaller scale example of how they would handle things politically. Now, on a larger scale, like say the president would handle rising prices in areas such as gas and oil. He would negotiate foreign treaties and make peace with foreign countries. Where on a smaller scale, a state governor might handle things such as illegal immigration and states' rights, such as making weed legal. Now, government experience isn't necessary, but say someone without government experience is put in the presidency. It's basically like putting an average 6th grader in the 12th grade. Now, the 6th grader would have an idea of what it's like to be in the 12th grade, but they aren't ready for it mentally because of the lack of information. Now, next comes political beliefs. This basically applies in terms of party. Of course, if the person running is a far-right conservative Republican, then most Republicans would vote for the person running and vice versa. When rallying and running for the president, they'll do whatever they can to make you want what they want to better the country's current political state. If a president goes into office saying to him, I sort of want to decrease taxes and I want to make our foreign policies better with the middle, but I'm not exactly sure how to do that, then obviously their political beliefs won't provide a strong base to run for the country. Third is access to a lot of money. When a candidate can be financially stretched, it provides a basis for a strong backed election campaign, which can make a big difference when running for president. Having a lot of money also allows candidates to see how much money they can devote to certain areas while still having some left over as a smaller scale version of the presidency. He has to propose budget plans and other economical ideas. Last on this slide is personal growth. If a candidate grows personally, it provides a stronger basis for everything in general, making them stronger politically, and from that, a stronger candidate to run as president. Especially in this case, when the public watches a candidate grow personally, it allows them to see how someone like you and me adapts to change. So, again, like stated in point before, it's like a smaller version of the presidency. Benefits and the rest. The president makes $400,000 a year, which is taxable. $50,000 in non-taxable expenses, such as to cover meetings that don't fall under the budget of another federal department or agency. This portion of his salary also covers personal things, such as food ordered for his private quarters and dry cleaning. $19,000 for an entertainment account, and $100,000 in travel. Now keep in mind the last three expenses listed or talked about, they are not given on 100%. It's just whatever he spends. So most of the president's expenses are paid for, but travel expenses as part of his job are necessary, as well as a salary to maintain a family structure like most average American families. Next comes housing of the White House. This is important because the White House is a place where politics happens, but also a symbol of power for our country. The White House is a bold statement saying this is where the president does his job, just like a cubicle or office is where someone does their work. Third comes free health, dental, and medical care for life. Now these things come as part of like a 401k type deal to the president. Now most Americans, or say all Americans, have a Social Security plan as a retirement. Now this is rewarded to the president after his service as the leader of our country. So he gets free health, medical, and dental care. He gets a lifetime pension of $148,000 a year, free office space, and up to $96,000 a year for office help and mailing services. The $148,000 also comes with a 401k package as stated before. The president's lifetime pension is his version of Social Security. Like many famous bands, the president does have assistants and fans, which is why the additional $96,000 comes into play. The $96,000 is given as a way to compensate for the services offered. Last point on the slide is Air Force One, Marine One, limos, and other transportation vehicles, just for security purposes and transport. Since the president is a very important man, he needs top priority protection because he runs the country. So say a teacher has to go away because something happens to him in the middle of a class. Now the class would probably would kind of collapse and things would fly across the room just because there would be no one to lead the class. So that's kind of a smaller scale example. So protection of him inside and outside the office is necessary, which is why security and vehicles are provided. Office and terms. Now I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide just because this is just information in general. Now first bullet is presidents serve 4-year terms. Now, originally, there was no restriction on how many terms a president could serve, but a standard was set by George Washington of 2 terms. Now, after George Washington ended his second term, he announced that he wasn't going to run a third term, although he could have, but he didn't want to. So that opened the door for other presidents to run, which is why John Adams became our president after George Washington served his 2 terms. Franklin Roosevelt served for almost 4 terms before dying. that totals to almost 16 years. Now that's a lot of time for just one person running the country. After Franklin Roosevelt finishes his terms, the 22nd Amendment was established in 1951. This stated that presidents may only serve for 2 4-year terms. Now, they do not have to be consecutive. Vice presidents that take office that have less than 2 years to election may serve 2 additional terms. Presidential succession. The Presidential Succession Act of 1947 established the succession of people who would take the office of president if the president had any situation in which he couldn't take office anymore. Examples include death and resignation, as seen cases of death such as Lincoln, and resignation in cases such as Nixon during the Watergate scandal. Now, at the top, the president is listed, and below him are 10 members of his cabinet, including the vice president. So, something happens to the president. Bam. The vice president takes over. Now, this list does go on. So, if something happens to the vice president, bam, then the Speaker of the House takes over. Something happens to the Speaker of the House. Then, the presidential pro tempore of the Senate takes over. Something happens to him. Then, the Secretary of State is left in charge of the presidency. Something happens to that position, bam. Then the Secretary of the Treasury takes over. Something happens to the Secretary of Treasury, bam. Then the Secretary of Defense takes over. Something happens to the Secretary of Defense, so they can't perform. Then the Attorney General takes over. Something happens to the Attorney General, bam. Then the Secretary of the Interior take over. Bam. Something happens to the Secretary of Interior. Then the Secretary of Agriculture takes over. Now, if something happens to the Secretary of Agriculture, bam, then the Secretary of Commerce takes over. Now, we have this system today because there have been real situations where presidents have died or couldn't be present for a period of time, to which a vice president took over. Some presidents this has happened to are Lincoln, Reagan, and John F. Kennedy. Examples like Reagan being shot bring forth the situation where Congress can't be notified immediately, so the vice president has to take over as president along with the Senate so he can inform Congress that the president has been disabled. If the president were disabled. Now you can ask yourself, what would happen if the president becomes disabled in office? Well, the vice president may become the acting president under 2 conditions, as established by the 25th Amendment. These 2 conditions are, 1, if the president informs Congress of inability to perform in office, and 2, if the VP and majority of the cabinet informs the Congress that the president is disabled. Now, the president can assume office by informing the Congress that the disability no longer exists. This has happened in history before, so what goes along with the slide is 10 presidents have been disabled in office, 6 of which died during the disability. These presidents are William Henry Harrison, who died of pneumonia, Zachary Taylor, who died from an acute intestinal obstruction. Lincoln was unconscious for about 9 hours before he died from a gunshot wound, and James Garfield and William McKinley both died of gunshot wounds while in office. As stated in the second bullet, 4 presidents did recover from disability. Woodrow Wilson suffered from a stroke for 280 days in office, to which his wife communicated for him from his bedside. Eisenhower suffered from a heart attack in 1955, which later convalesced to a stroke. He was also incapacitated for an operation for ilitis. Ronald Reagan was incapacitated during surgery from his gunshot wound, and later for his colon. The Vice President and his roles. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this just because the title of the PowerPoint is the presidency, and a lot of the information listed on this slide has been covered in the slides leading up to this. So the first point that's basically going to set the tide for this is the Vice President takes on 7 major roles in assistance to the President. These include 1. He is the President of the Senate. Now, as the Representatives has a Speaker of the House as their head person, the Vice President is the head person of the Senate. Second, he helps decide if the President is disabled or not. Now, he does not make the executive decision. Congress does that. But he takes that information to the Senate, to which both parties go and take the information to Congress, and Congress makes that final executive decision. Third, the Vice President represents the President. So, as you see when the President goes on TV in some speeches or stuff, the Vice President is standing behind the President most often. Now, he does act as a lawyer, in a sense, for the President, if the President ever gets in that type of deal, as with most common people today, or actually all common people today get a lawyer when they go to court. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to call the Vice President a lawyer for the President, because he's not. Certain details of a lawyer do apply to parts of the Vice President's job, which is where that comes from. Fourth, the Vice President attends state funerals such as those of the President or other members. Now, this is a point out of respect, and as part of a job, he is kind of obligated to be at these funerals, which basically summarizes that. Fifth, he is a diplomat for the U.S. Now, the President and the Vice President don't always stick together as a package. The Vice President does go to certain countries when the President can't be there, just to represent the U.S., because the U.S. is very much involved in many countries around the world. So that covers that point. Sixth, he defends the President whether they are guilty or not. So this basically goes along with point 3 in the lawyer position. As shown in Nixon in the Watergate scandal, the Vice President, Nixon's Vice President, was involved in that scandal. So out of shame, he kind of left that position, and which left the door open, and Ford took the presidency after Nixon resigned. Last is the Vice President is a member of the Security Council. So in matters of security, the Vice President makes a lot of decisions along with the rest of the council. So this is the PowerPoint on the presidency and a little bit about the vice presidency. I do hope you learned a lot. This information is very important in government, especially if your dream is to be in politics or to become the president. So, thanks for listening. The presidency was elected by popular vote through an electoral college rather than parliament, which occurred before the Constitution. Requirements to become a president include: first, the president must be a natural-born citizen of the U.S. Under certain conditions can the president be born outside the U.S. For example, if an American couple bear a child in China and he or she chooses to become a legal U.S. citizen at the age of 18, then they are eligible to run for the office of president despite 5 years old. Not 34, not 36, but 35, as you can see my Monty Python Holy Grenade reference. This requirement is important because what if we had younger candidates running for president, like people 13 to 20? That could, like, 13 could be the lowest age that you could run for president. Obviously, with less age comes less experience. And if we had the presidency has been a long treasured position among politicians alike. Presidents have held office since before the Constitution. Many qualifications are required of the job, and benefits are reaped if one is elected to the office. With this introduction, let's get started. Qualifications. Ever since the Constitution was enacted, the president, a young person, take office with inadequate experience, it could lead the country on a path of destruction, which would take a lot to recuperate. Some fun facts about that is the youngest president ever was Theodore Roosevelt, who took the office of president at the age of 42 after McKinley's assassination. Now, most people would say that JFK was the youngest president, which is true if you're the youngest president to be elected to office, which Kennedy was, the fact that they were born in China. This qualification is important because it prevents any feeling of nationality from influencing a candidate. Therefore, if a 100% Chinese person took over the presidency, it might provoke the Chinese to use the president by using him for their own benefit rather than him or her leading the U.S. as they are supposed to. Second point brought up is to be eligible for president, you have to be at least 35